Hi everyone, welcome to another video on AWS. In this video, we are going to talk about a command line tool that lets you interact with your AWS services, and it's called AWS CLI. So these are the topics that I'm going to cover today. We'll start with what and why, and then we'll proceed to installation. We will see different authentication and access credentials, and we will see how we can configure AWS CLI, and finally how we can use it. Let's start with the main question. What is AWS CLI? So it's an open source tool that lets you interact with your AWS resources and lets you manage it programmatically. So all the things that you can do using the GUI or the graphical user interface of AWS, which is also referred to as AWS Management Console. You can do all those things via AWS CLI without having to visit the GUI. And the latest AWS CLI version as of today is version 2. Okay, now the question is, why would you use AWS CLI? So it has a lot of different advantages because, as I said, you can use it programmatically, so you don't have to go to the GUI every time, and instead you can write scripts that can do all those tasks for you. So here are the three main points that I think are really important to understand why we would want to use AWS CLI. The first one is automation, because in the GUI you do lots of repetitive tasks. You go to let's say if you want to create a Lambda function, you go to the Lambda console, you click on Lambda function and then specify all those parameters, and then finally you have Lambda function. So instead what you can do is you can have a script where you have this command of creating Lambda function. So instead of doing this repetitively, you can simply have a script that does this work for you. And so yeah, the second point is flexibility, meaning it provides consistent CLI across various platforms, meaning even if you are working in Linux, Mac or Windows, you don't have to change your script. All the commands are same and be easily integrated with other tools and script seamlessly. Let's suppose you have a Python script that utilizes AWS CLI commands for managing your resources. So you can easily integrate the AWS CLI command within your Python script using subprocess or os.system modules and so on. So this allows you to leverage the power of AWS CLI command within your existing Python code and enhance its capabilities. Finally, efficiency. So because you are not going through the GUI, the tasks are let's say the operations that you want to perform are really fast, because you are not waiting for let's say browser to render all those responses. The next part is installation. So we will, because this is both theory and lab tutorial, I will show you how you can install it. So installation of AWS CLI is very simple and it's very straightforward. We will follow the AWS documentation for this. So you can go to AWS official website and you can find this section for install or update AWS CLI, and you can find here different options for different operating system. So you have for Linux, Mac and Windows. So I'm going for Mac. So you have basically two commands that you need to run. The first one is where we actually download the AWS CLI package, and the second one is where we actually install it. So because I have already done this, I will skip these two steps and I will move on to third step, where we verify whether or not we have AWS CLI installed. So for this, I will go to my terminal and I will type which AWS. This will specify the location where the AWS is installed, and for AWS version, we will type AWS -- version. Cool. So this means I do have AWS CLI version 2 installed, and now I am ready to go. Cool. So now once you have installed AWS CLI, the important part comes now. The thing is, this AWS CLI is going to make requests to AWS and to your AWS resources on your behalf. So it needs to have some sort of credentials so that it can access all the resource, and let's say the AWS can recognize that the requests are the valid request. There are a lot of different ways you can provide authentication, or let's say the AWS CLI can authenticate itself with the AWS server. So the first one is using IAM user credentials. This is not the recommended one. The second one is IAM user role, and we have a lot of different options. The most recommended one is using AWS Identity Center. But for this tutorial, I'm going to use the first one because it is pretty straightforward and very simple to let's get started with. So for this, we are going to create a user, and we will use the credentials of those users for our AWS CLI, so that whenever AWS CLI makes request to the AWS server, it is a validated request. To create a user, we will go to the AWS Management Console, and we are here. So we will go to the users, not the users, we'll go to the IAM. Let's search for IAM, and this is where you can manage user and roles and permission and all those stuff. Okay, we'll go to users, and I will create a user here. I'll name it AWS CLI test user. I don't want to provide user access. I don't want to provide user to access the AWS Management Console. So I'll click on next. And right now I'm not attaching any policies as of now. I'm simply creating the user. Okay, so now we have this user. To be able to use this user's credential, first we need to create one. So we will go to our user that we just created, and in the security credential section here, if you scroll down, you can see here access keys. So because we want to use AWS CLI to access our resources, we need to provide some sort of access keys, so that whenever AWS CLI is making a request to AWS, it can validate itself. So for this, we will create some access keys, and here are the options for why you would want to create these access keys. So for us, we are using this CLI tool, so we will click on command line interface, and we'll click on I understand, and finally we click on next. You can provide the description as to why you are creating this key. So I'll write, I'm creating this key for AWS CLI. Yeah. So we'll click on create access key. Okay, so before you proceed ahead, there are a couple of things that you need to know before. So once you create these access keys, you have this access key and secret access key. So the only time you can access them, or let's say view them, is when you are creating it. So when you click on show, you can see this access key. So once you click on done, you will no longer be able to view this access key. So if you want to use it, you'd have to create another one. So you have let's say two options here. One is you can download this file. So I will download this CSV file, and another option is you can simply copy it and use it. Okay, so I have downloaded it, meaning I will have access to all these access key and secret key. So now I will click on done, and now we have security credentials, or basically now we have access key created for our AWS CLI test user. And if you scroll here, as you can see in the summary section, you can only see the access key and not the secret key. So now if you want to view it, you can't unless you have downloaded it or saved it somewhere else. Okay, so now we have a user and we have the access key. So now we will configure our AWS CLI so that our AWS CLI can make some request to AWS server for us. So now, okay, configuration. So once we have a user, we have the credentials. Now we need to configure our AWS CLI so that it can understand how to interact with AWS. So there are two types of settings when we are configuring our AWS CLI. The first one is the credentials. Of course, you need to have access key to be able to make requests to AWS server, and another one is referred to as other configuration details, where you provide some options as to how you want to process requests. For example, you want to see the output in JSON format, or you want to specify the AWS region. So these are the two settings that you need to configure for your AWS CLI before you actually start working with it. So there are a lot of different options as to how you can configure it. The simplest one is credentials file. So here you save your configuration in a file, and under the section of profile, so you can have multiple profile, meaning in a single file you can add credentials for multiple different types of user who has different types of permissions, and you can of course reference them when you are making requests to any of your AWS services or AWS resource. The second one is using environment variables. So instead of saving those credentials in a file, you have them in your system's environment variable, and then you can access it. And the last one is command line option. So in the command line option, the only thing that you can actually do is you can reference the different profiles that you have created in your credentials file. So the normal way, or let's say the most common way to use this, is you create a credential file with multiple different profiles, and then you use command line options to let's say reference one of those profiles. We will go through all of these options and see how they work for AWS CLI. So now we have all the things that we need. So the simplest way to configure your AWS CLI is this simple command called AWS configure, and here you will provide the access key here. So I didn't copy the access key, so what I will do is I will just print it out here. It's in my downloads, AWS test. Okay, so these are my credentials. The first one is the access key, and the second one is secret key. Okay, so we'll run the command AWS configure. Now it will ask me for AWS access key. So this is the one. I'll copy it, paste it. And now it will ask me for access key, the secret key. So this is the one, all the way from here. Copy, paste. And this is the default region name. So let's use US East 1. And okay, let's specify JSON for now. Okay, cool. So with this, now we have configured our AWS CLI with all the necessary credentials that it needs, and now we are ready to make some requests to AWS server. So let's see what we can actually do. So I'll do for Lambda. So if you're not familiar with the command, the simplest way is to type AWS, the AWS service that you want to work with, and help. It will give you all the basic list of all the commands that you can type here. So if I scroll down, as you can see a lot of different functions, different commands that you can run. So I'll take this one. So this will list out all the AWS functions that I have created so far. So now what I will do is AWS lambda and type the command. So this should give me a function. Okay, so it is giving me access denied exception, because the thing is I did create an user, but I didn't attach any policies to that user. So the next thing that I'm going to do is now add some policy to that user so that we can actually access this AWS Lambda resource. So I will go back to AWS Management Console, and in here, if you go in the users, and here you have different permissions. So what we are going to do is we'll click on add permission, and we will simply add different permissions. I'll attach policies directly, and because I'm going to work with AWS Lambda, I will search for Lambda. Okay, so here it is. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm using AWS Lambda full access, but make sure to provide only the access that you need. So I will use this one, and I'll click on next and add permission. So with this, now my AWS test user have all the necessary permissions that for it to access the AWS Lambda. Before I start to work with AWS CLI, I'll quickly go to my AWS Lambda, and I'll just create a new Lambda function just to see everything is working. And I'll create a new function. I'll name it AWS CLI function. I'm going to use Python, and that's it. Create function. The AWS Lambda function is now created, and if I go to functions, I can see that I have two functions here. So now I'll go back to my terminal, and now I'll try to rerun the same command and see if I can get the list of all the Lambda functions that I have. One thing to notice is that when you attach policies to your user, it takes some time for it to take effect. So I waited for some time, and now when I'm running this command, I can actually see all the different Lambda functions that I have with all their details. So this is the one that I created right now, and I named it AWS CLI function. Here I can see everything about my function. So if I press enter, I can see all the other details, such as the timeout, the role, the runtime, execution, and so on. So this is how you can easily interact with your AWS services without having to use the GUI. Okay, so what we did was we configured our AWS CLI. So now the question is, when we are configuring it, where does this AWS CLI actually store these access keys? So all of these are stored in your home directory and inside the AWS folder. So if you go inside it, you will see two different files. One is config and the second one is credentials. So as I stated earlier, when you are configuring, you configure two things. The first one is credentials for it to access the AWS resource, and the second one is more of a different configurations that you want to have, for example the JSON output and so on. So if I want to look at the content of config, I can see here that I have this default section. So this is referred to as profile. So you can have multiple profiles where you have different reason and different output format. Similarly, I will look for the credentials, and I will see that I do have a default profile where it has AWS access key ID, AWS secret access key ID, and so on. So in this way, you can have multiple profiles, and this is how you can configure your AWS CLI in the easiest way possible. So there are other ways as well. So instead of typing it, let's say copy and pasting all those access keys, what you can do is, instead of doing this, you can simply import the file that we downloaded when we were creating the access key for our user. And to do that, first thing that we'll do is I'll first remove this, so that we do everything from scratch. So because this is a folder, I need to provide okay, so now I should not have these credentials. Just to verify, okay, I don't have it. And just to double check it, I'll try to run the AWS command, and I should get an error. So yeah, I did get an error because I don't have any configurations as of now. To use the file, we will use the command import -- CSV, and we need to specify the file path. So it's in my downloads, and name is AWS CLI test. Okay, so two things. So when we are importing it, we need to specify the username, or basically the profile that we want to have for this specific access keys. So here when we were using AWS configure, AWS CLI was responsible for creating this file, adding this default profile. So because now we are doing it via the import, we need to edit our CSV file that we have and add a new header for our username. So let's do that. We're going to edit the file that we downloaded. So it's in my downloads, name is AWS. Cool. So you can add it either at at the beginning or at the end, it does not matter, and you can have either use uppercase or lowercase, it does not matter. It is case insensitive. The only thing is that you need to put, specify user space name. That's the most important thing. And I will just add the name. Let's say I'll name it profile 1, let's say AWS profile 1, and I will save it. Okay, so now what I will do is I will try to rerun the previous command. Okay, so the problem is that so this is the problem with AWS CLI. It does not give you the accurate exception, especially for this command. So what we are actually missing here is the file prefix when we are providing the location of our file. That will be file colon, and that's it. So now if we look at our .aws folder, we should have a new credential and config there. So I'll check our new credentials and config file that was created using the import option. So let's look it inside AWS, and we do in fact have our credentials. And as you can see, instead of default, we have AWS profile 1, which we specified or edited in our downloaded CSV file. Similarly, let's look for the config. AWS. I don't think we have config because we didn't specify anything for the config. So let's leave it for now. And now let's try to rerun the command where we are trying to list out all the Lambda functions that we have. So it was AWS Lambda list functions. Okay, so when we are working with Lambda functions, we need to configure our reason. So for this, what we'll do is we'll use this command AWS configure set, and then we want to set the reason, and we'll specify the profile for which profile we want to set this reason. And the profile that we created was AWS profile 1, AWS profile 1. We are missing the value. I want it to be US est 1 because that's where my Lambda function is. So now if I look at my configuration inside the AWS folder, I should have it here. Yeah, we have, and I do have the reason. So if I were to run the set configuration command without the profile, let's see what happens. So I will not provide this parameter profile, and I will run it. So when I do this, what happens is it goes into the default one. So now I should have two profiles. Yeah, the first one is profile AWS 1 and the second one is default. Okay, now let's run our previous command of fetching the list of all the Lambda functions that we have. So AWS Lambda list functions. Okay, so now the problem is when we run this command, it automatically assumes that we are trying to use the default profile, and if we don't have the default profile, we'll get this error. So one thing that you can do is when running this command, we can specify the profile here the same way we set our reason. So here I will name it, it was AWS profile 1. So when I do this, what AWS CLI understands is that I'm trying to use the profile named AWS user 1. So now we do have the output from this command, and I can see all the functions. So this is how you work with AWS credentials file and how you can configure it. And there is the other option as well, where you work with environment variables instead of these files. So let's try that one as well. So what I'll do is I'll clear it out, and I will print out the credentials so that I can use them later on. AWS credentials. Cool. Okay, now I'm going to delete them. It is in the AWS, so I want to delete everything. Okay, so now if I run AWS lambda list functions and specify the profile AWS user 1, I should get an error. Good. So now what we'll do is we'll try to set these values in our environment, systems environment, and then AWS CLI will look for those access keys in our environment variable, and if it finds one, it should be able to make request. So the environment variables that AWS CLI looks for are these ones. Let's go to the AWS documentation, and here you have how to set environment variables, and here are the list of all the supported environment variables, or basically the environment variables that AWS CLI looks for. So if you want to provide the access key, this should be the name of the variable, and so on. So these are the ones that we are going to use. We'll be using AWS access key ID, AWS secret access key, and AWS default reason. So let's copy this command, export AWS access key. Let's copy it, let's paste it here. Of course, we will replace the access key ID here with the ones that we have. This is ours, Command C, Command V, good. And we will do the same for secret key as well. So let's copy this one, paste it here, and we want to replace the secret key with the ones that we have. I'll copy it and paste it. Sorry. Okay, so I did add an additional character here, the $sign. Let's remove it. Okay, so now we have access key and secret key. The last one is the AWS reason. So let's copy it and paste it. It was AWS East 1. Okay, just to verify, AWS access key ID. We will run the echo command and provide the environment variable that we are looking for. Let's copy it and paste it. Okay, so now we do have these access key and secret key in our systems environment, and now AWS CLI will be able to access them and then make a request to our AWS server. So we'll again rerun the previous command, AWS lambda list functions. Cool. So now we have all the functions that we created. So this is how you work with AWS CLI, and this is just let's say beginner's tutorial, which lets you understand what AWS CLI is, how you can configure it, and how you can use it. So I think, yeah, that's for this video. So if you have any questions, confusions, or if you have any suggestions, please write them in the comment section. And yeah, I will see you in another video. So stay tuned.